Thanks, Alan. It's a great pleasure to address this ANZSOG conference. Thanks very much for inviting me. Today, with its policy focus, for me has been a sharp break from the election campaign of the past 3 to 4 weeks. Now, in these remarks today, I want to try and do three things. I've got a lot of territory to cover. First, describe the transformation in Australia's political culture and the problems it raises for reform. Second, to identify the factors that made the previous era, the post-1983 reform era, so successful. And thirdly, look at where we go from here. And I'll make a confession at the start that the weakest part of this address will deal with future solutions simply because they're the most difficult to discern. Election 2010 is a dramatic testimony to the shift in Australia's political culture towards policy timidity and short-term horizons. The evidence is plentiful, the most dramatic being Kevin Rudd's removal from office, the first time a palace coup had replaced a first-term Prime Minister. The Labor Party now has had 4 different leaders over the last 4 elections. Beazley in 01, Latham in 04, Rudd in 07 and Gillard in 2010. Its intolerance towards poor polls has sealed a new intensity, impatience and uncertainty, with a dangerous predilection not to fix problems but to shoot leaders. The Liberal Party itself has had 3 parliamentary leaders over this term, Nelson, Turnbull and Abbott. And the 11-year-long Howard era now seems a nostalgic aberration in terms of its leadership stability. Volatility is the name of the game now. When Rudd defeated Howard in 07, you could have got odds of 100 to 1, literally, that the next election would be a Gillard-Abbott contest. Yet the improbable has come to pass. The old working rules of Australian politics are being torn up. It is not clear what the new rules are, or if rules as such is the way to think about things. My view is that the historic post-1983 reform era, marking the Hawke, Keating and part of the Howard governments, is largely terminated. If resuscitated, it will take a different form. The causes of its death were complex, although perhaps inevitable. Let me try to identify them. I see a number of structural factors at work. First, the post-2003 terms of trade boom, driven by China and the emerging economies, has engendered a pervasive complacency in Australia. It is often said that reform is driven by crisis, not prosperity. That's true, I think. It's also said that the Australian character is relaxed in prosperity and only propelled into action by crisis, and there's probably something in that. I think post-2003, Howard and Costello didn't grasp the scale of the new national income surge or how to maximise its dividend. Too much was spent, not enough was invested in reform or enhancing a new productivity agenda. The political will to restructure and improve government programs was lost. There was not sufficient commitment to competition policy, reform of federalism, education and better infrastructure. Peter Costello held out many hopes, yet disappointed too often. The release of the first intergenerational report in 01-02 was the chance for a new reform agenda, not properly seized. Under the Rudd government, Australia has survived the global financial crisis without a technical recession, assisted in part by its integration with China. This is a great result, but it has a legacy. I think Australia, psychologically divorced from the crisis in the North Atlantic zone, is drifting. The public experiences cost of living pressures, but the political leaders feel no compulsion to offer a substantive reform agenda. Ross Garnaut, I believe, was correct last night in identifying the unbroken 20-year-old Australian growth cycle as inculcating a lethargy in our political system. I find it irritating in the current campaign that we have the Labor leaders talking about surviving the global financial crisis, because they spent a lot of money. This overlooks the bigger picture. We survive because of the overall quality of our public policy and our reform, inheritance and agenda. This relates to issues such as our financial institutions and banks avoiding the subprime crisis, no public debt overhang, and the fact that our Treasury and Central Bank moved very quickly given the crisis, as well as our integration with China. Now, the second factor I want to highlight, however, relates to what I call botched reforms. There are many examples, but the main ones I would focus on are Howard's work choices, Rudd's carbon pollution reduction scheme, and Rudd's mining tax. Now, the moral from these exercises is not just how difficult it is to bring reforms to fruition, but it's that botched reforms have damaging and counterproductive consequences. Work choices was misconceived. It helped to destroy the Howard government and turn the public away from a more flexible labour market to a more regulated labour market. It's virtually impossible to even discuss this subject in rational terms today in this country, and it has definitely made the coalition trigger shy on reforms across the board. Its tragedy, of course, is that Howard in his final terms had control of both houses, the Senate as well as the lower house, and the reform dividend from this situation, having control of both houses, looks particularly meagre in retrospect. There are many lessons from the climate change debacle. The single most important was Labor's decision not to price carbon without the political cover of bipartisanship. This timidity was reflected in Rudd's paralysis after his bills died in the Senate, and again in his April 2010 decision to defer the issue for another 3 years. Remember, at the end of John Howard's first term, he went to an election on an unpopular GST, while at the comparable time in Rudd's first term, he refused to take his ETS to an election despite branding it the moral test of the age. This was a failure of conviction. It's left the climate change debate in this country in a confused, weakened and fragmented state. Note, however, there's one possible excuse for the Rudd-Gillard retreat. Their claim that if they had proceeded, their reform may not have stuck, and that would have been a disaster. On the mining tax, Labor broke every rule in the tax reform book. It ambushed the industry. It misunderstood the financial impact of its tax on the industry. It shunned consultation, judging it would be advantaged politically by the confrontation that followed. And it misjudged. This was a failure of process. This process had none of the industry consultation involved in the Hawke government's petroleum tax. It could not have been more different from the Hawke-Keating 1985 tax reform process, a taxation white paper done by the Treasury, released for debate, a taxation summit, significant modifications to the package arising from the summit, and then the final decisions. Ultimately, the mining tax cost Rudd the Prime Ministership. It leaves the shadow of doubt hanging over further serious tax reform. Now, the third factor I want to nominate in terms of the problems facing reform today is the triumph of short-termism in the policy and politics, driven by the 24-hour media cycle and the focus group mentality. And this is a profound problem. The dilemma facing democracies today is the contradiction between the need for long-run policy commitments based on demography, climate change, tax infrastructure and the economy on the one hand, and on the other hand, the fact that the politicians run according to a 24-hour media agenda. They conduct each day a 24-hour media battle, and a 3-year term consists of 1,000 such daily contests. Party faiths and ideological conviction are in decline. Both parties need incumbency to bestow patronage upon their power networks and supporters. Because their market research is the same, they offer small variations on the same theme. Witness in this campaign what's happened to immigration, boat people, the return to surplus and industrial relations, where Gillard and Abbott cling to each other. Sometimes bipartisanship is desirable, sometimes it stifles creative debate. In this political culture, safety first is the supreme rule. The power of the negative campaign prevails. Negative campaigns work. Both sides know this. Paul Keating's famous 1993 victory off the back of his anti-GST campaign set the standard. Howard's destruction off the back of work choices confirmed it. In this campaign, Gillard is not prepared to expose herself to attack from Abbott by promising a carbon price and an ETS. Instead, she says Labor will move only when there's a political consensus, that is, when the opposition gives her a free pass. Abbott, in turn, has walked away from any industrial relations liberalisation, the first time in a generation when the Liberal Party has gone to an election campaign without a commitment to IR reform. The problem is obvious. The power of the negative campaign that the media will play to and play up, and that will be reinforced by political advertising. There are many other consequences. One is the related need in reforms to operate by the rule, everybody is a winner. This is a deeply inhibiting factor. It influenced the Howard government. It influenced the Rudd government's generous compensation in its carbon pollution reduction scheme. It was Howard's failure to honour this rule